Howard Zinn critiques America's response to 9/11 in his latest collection of essays, A Power Governments Cannot Suppress. This talk from Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts, is just over an hour.
You know, Howard came and read here about a year and a half ago for us, and not long after he read, I picked up a book called World Beware about the current state of American politics, written by a man who coined the phrase counterculture. And I found out that he couldn't find a single publisher in the United States to pick up his book. There was not anyone who would touch it. I think people get the impression that as long as books like If I Did It by O.J. Simpson can get published, anything can get published. And it's not the case. So tonight we're here to celebrate something very, very fortunate, that books like this can be published. A Power Governments Cannot Suppress can be published by amazing presses like Cites, and we can hear the voice directly of some of the greatest statesmen living in the United States today, some of the greatest intellectuals, and I'm proud to introduce one of them now. Please welcome Howard Zinn.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Alex. And thank you, whoever you are who applauded. If you didn't applaud, thanks anyway. Alex is from Backpages Books, right here on Moody Street in Waltham, and they're responsible for this. And I want to thank them. They're struggling, I hope he doesn't mind my saying this, but they are. They're a struggling little bookstore, and they need support like all struggling little bookstores. And, I think that we need to direct people more to bookstores and to libraries, away from television, away from the newspapers. I say away from television, even though I know there's a television camera focused on us right now. The question is, will they turn us off as a result of this? No, this is different. This is special. And this book, A Power That Governments Cannot Suppress, a man named Greg Ruggiero decided on this book. I didn't really write the book. I wrote the stuff that's in it. And he put it together. That is, there's a bunch of essays. It's a bunch of essays that I've done over the last 3 or 4 years, many of them for the Progressive magazine, some of them here and there. I did an essay on Thoreau for Princeton University Press. I did an essay on Eugene Debs. Oh, those two go together, don't they? Yeah. And a kind of socialist and anarchist. I haven't done anything on any Republican that I know of, but anyway, you'll find all sorts of things in this book, things that even surprise me when I find it's there. So, but the basic idea of the book, I don't read, they always talk about these things as somebody's going to do a reading. I never read from my books. I don't think they're worth it. I mean, I'll read from Tolstoy or Thoreau or Mark Twain, but no, I read from my, then you're stuck with it. Whereas if you pick up the book and you read something of mine, you can immediately put it down if you like and go on to something else. So I won't read from my book, but I'll try to tell you something about what's in it, or at least, what is suggested by this book. Fundamentally, the book tries to make a connection between history and what is going on today. That's always been my attitude as a historian. Right? I've never been interested in just doing history to go into the archives and look up these old letters and documents. It's interesting, of course. It's fun. But no, that's not the kind of history I wanted to do. I wanted to go into history and come out into the present. I wanted to make a connection between something that happened in the past, because I wanted history to help us in dealing with the situation we face today. And we're always facing a situation today, especially today, especially now with an administration that has taken us into 2 wars in a few years, with an administration that has run amok with power, that has attacked the constitutional rights of people all over this country, an administration that has wasted the enormous wealth that this country has on war and on funneling this wealth into the upper richest 1% of the population, an administration that has taken power unto itself and will not listen to anything that anybody says except maybe 4 or 5 people around the president. So we're in a situation now where we, I think, desperately need to learn something from history, because I feel that if people of the United States at that moment when George Bush got up before the microphone and said, you know, we must go to war, 9/11 took place, terrorist act took place, and therefore we must go to war against Afghanistan. Well, if people listening knew history, they would not immediately rush, as most Americans did at that point. 80% of Americans rushed to say yes, yes. Congress, of course, rushed to say yes, because that's the job of Congress, to say yes whenever the president wants to go to war. But if people knew some history, there would not be that rush to support a war. There would not be that acceptance of the idea, oh, we're going to war to fight terrorism. There would not be an acceptance of the idea, we're going to war to bring democracy to Iraq, bring democracy to the whole Middle East. Because if people knew some history, they would know of all those instances in the American past when presidents have come before the public and said, well, as President Polk did in 1846, we've got to go into Mexico to spread civilization to the Mexicans. Or as McKinley did in 1898, oh, we've got to go to Cuba to liberate the Cubans. We're always liberating somebody. But we went into Cuba and we liberated the Cubans. In fact, we did. We liberated the Cubans from Spain, but not from us. And that's our record. Our record is sometimes liberating people from other tyrants and then imposing our will on them. So the Spanish were out of Cuba in 1898, and American corporations and American military were in Cuba and stayed there for a very long time, dictatorship after dictatorship after dictatorship, supported by the United States. If people knew some of that history, if they knew the history of the American occupation of the Philippines, they would be very wary of an American occupation of Iraq. They'd be very wary of the idea, oh, we're occupying Iraq so that we can bring democracy to Iraq. We fought a bloody war in the Philippines. We committed massacres in the Philippines. And then we occupied the Philippine Islands for 50 years. And did we bring democracy to the Philippines? We brought dictatorship after dictatorship and misery to the Filipino people, about 500,000 of whom had died in the war that we waged against the Filipinos. And of course, the history then into the 20th century, into the Marines going again and again into the Caribbean. General Smedley Butler, I advise you to look General Smedley Butler up, a Marine general who won 2 Congressional Medals of Honor, leading the military into various countries in Central America. And at a certain point, he stopped and turned around and said, you know, I was an errand boy for Wall Street. He realized that what he had done, what the American military had done in Central America, was to try to make Central America, the various countries in Central America, in the Caribbean, in Haiti, in the Dominican Republic, in Nicaragua, in Honduras, to make them profitable places for American corporations, not places where democracy would flourish. In fact, democracy did not flourish in all of those places where we sent the Marines to take over and to do the bidding of American economic interests. And of course, bringing the history up to more recent time, if people even studied closely the history of the Vietnam War, that wasn't that long ago, was it? there are actually people here who remember the Vietnam War. Despite the attempts of the media to forget the Vietnam War, despite the attempts of our political leaders, when we went into Iraq the first time in 1991 and won this quick, smashing victory, a splendid little war, just like the Spanish-American War, a very quick, victorious war, and George Bush said, Senior, that's the smarter one. George Bush Senior said, well, we have now buried the Vietnam syndrome in the sands of the Arabian Peninsula. Rare poetic statement out of the White House. Well, the fact is we have not buried the Vietnam syndrome. Vietnam is coming back to haunt us, and people are thinking about that more and more every day. And if people remembered Vietnam, they would remember how the calls for withdrawal that came early on. I must say, in 1967, 2 years after we were escalating the war, in 1967, I wrote a book. I love to advertise my books. I'll try to resist it later on, but I can't resist this one. In 1967, I wrote a book called Vietnam, The Logic of Withdrawal. And mine was, I must say, the first book. There had been a number of books on the war in Vietnam, and mine was the first book that called simply for the United States to get out, not equivocating, not setting timetables, not saying we'll get out if and when. We're not going to go to Paris and negotiate for 5 years or 6 years. We just have to get out. And the arguments against that at that time were the same as the arguments today when people say, as I say, and as a number of people have said, as Congressman Murta, a Vietnam veteran, said, no, we must just leave. We don't belong there. It's not our country. Get out of there. Let the Iraqis determine their own destiny. As difficult as it will be, but we are making it more difficult by our occupation. And the arguments then were the same. Well, we can't do that. There'll be chaos. There'll be chaos in Vietnam? There was chaos in Vietnam. We were bombing Vietnam into eternity. We were destroying Vietnamese villages. We were destroying their land. We were killing their people. Ultimately, 2 million people died in Vietnam, and we mustn't leave because there'll be chaos in Vietnam. So we stayed. We didn't leave in 1967 when a few of us were calling for withdrawal. We stayed, and what was the result? Another 30,000 American dead, another million Vietnamese dead. And so the same arguments today resonate, we mustn't leave Iraq, as if our presence in Iraq is preventing civil war. The question is our presence preventing civil war, or is our presence provoking civil war? And I think the answer is clear, just looking at a history of these 4 years of our occupation in Iraq. Iraq is a mess after 4 years. And the numbers of Iraqi dead and wounded are enormous, into the hundreds of thousands. So yes, the history is useful. And not the history that you get in the traditional textbooks, but the history that a citizen learns for himself or herself when a citizen goes to the library, or when a citizen listens to the independent media, when a citizen reads alternative journals instead of simply, watching CNN, and Fox News. So yes, history is very useful. It still is today, and I think that one of the things we might learn from history, and this is very, very important conclusion to get from the long history of this country, is that the government's interests are not necessarily the same as ours. In fact, are rarely the same as ours. Because if you think the government's interests are the same